The topic I will be discussing today is education. My main claim is standardized testing has a negative effect on students in the U.S. James Popham states that standardized tests have been used to evaluate American schools since 1965. Just in case no one knows what a standardized test is, a standardized test is any test that's administered, scored, and interpreted in a standard, predetermined manner. Basically, it's a test that is given the same way in the same manner each year. A 9-year study by the National Research Council in 2011 concluded that the emphasis on testing yielded little learning progress but caused significant harm. My three main reasons are: 1, standardized tests do not accurately define students; 2, the cost of standardized tests; and 3, the amount of time lost for curriculum to preparing for these standardized tests. First off, standardized testing doesn't accurately define any student's overall performance and gain from the school year. William Hiss, former Dean of Admissions for Bates College in Lewiston, Maine, agrees that there are too many different components to human intelligence and that standardized testing systems cannot capture it. The scores from, for example, the SAT can definitely help spot a talented student, but they often prevent applications instead of encouraging them. Because some schools you can decide whether you can turn in your SAT scores or not. Actual grades are more consistent to be determined by because they are more consistent during a long period of time rather than a 4-hour test taken in the morning. There are many factors that go into play the day of the test as well. A child or student might just have a bad morning, either at home or on their way to school, which would significantly have a factor on their performance on a test. Secondly is the severely negative costs that these standardized tests are. A new report by the Washington-based Brown Center on Education Policy at the Brookings Institution calculates states spend a combined $1.7 billion annually on standardized testing. The amount of money you put into each student's standardized testing is ridiculous and could definitely benefit the student in a different area of his or her education. The cost of tests, testing services, and test prep materials is estimated to be more than $2.3 billion a year and rapidly growing, according to EduVentures Inc. Economist Richard Phelps states that the U.S. schools suffer from too much standardized testing and that it amounts to a complete and utter waste of resources. The estimate breaks down to about $575 per student each year. Lastly, the amount of time and stress that these standardized tests bring on to each student in the classroom each year has a negative effect on them. In mathematics, 29 nations outperform the U.S. by a statistically significant margin. In reading, 19, and in science, 22. In reading, 19 nations, and in science, 22 nations. These numbers show that we are definitely not the top nation in education. One way I believe we can fix that is cutting out standardized testing and focusing more on the curriculum and objectives of each class. Not only do standardized tests waste time, but they also are a huge unnecessary stress factor weighing down U.S. students. According to Nikki Hayes, editor of Foundations of Psychology, a student's reaction, for example, to a teacher's reminder that a final exam will be presented next week may induce stress that triggers the sympathetic division of the autonomic, nervous, and endocrine systems. Standardized testing brings on what is called exam stress. Examples of this are disturbed sleeping patterns, tiredness, worry, irregular eating habits, increased infections, and the inability to concentrate. All these negative aspects that standardized testing bring in can be enhanced and changed positively into learning more of the curriculum needed to become a successful, educated individual. Finally, standardized testing has a negative effect on the students in the U.S., and three main reasons are: standardized testing does not properly define a student; 2, there is a great loss of money for the standardized test to take place; and 3, standardized testing does not only waste money, but brings on unnecessary stress to students. A solution to the problem would be to have no standardized tests, and that each student will be judged on their grades and performances in the classroom for each year.
All right, Brandon, the proposition's clearly labeled. The secondary points are previewed for us, although in the phrasing in the opening section, they're not always stated as claims. The second point especially, it's just a label. The third point was a little iffy to begin with. I thought it was better in the body of the speech when you got to that individual point. It sounded like a more complete statement, although the second point still isn't really making a declarative argument on that particular point. It's just information on this. You've got some good general information that you use in the beginning to kind of generate the controversy and tell us why we're having to talk about this. And on the first point, you've got a nice piece of testimony about how it's not necessarily important or useful, although it is simply limited to SAT tests. And I'm not exactly sure that it dismisses the value of the test entirely. It does suggest that there are other ways of assigning that information, but there's not much explanation about how the standardized tests are being used outside of the SAT, and I'm assuming that the SAT is used primarily for the purpose of admissions policy. So if you want to talk about admissions policies, I think you could maybe develop that argument a little bit more. On the second point on costs, nobody's saying that it's free. I understand that, but how significant are those costs? You mentioned it's $2 billion or a little bit more annually. And you've got an estimated cost of an individual student, $500 or so per student. I'm assuming that includes all the tests that they would be doing as part of the assessment. And how much do we spend on students and how much is spent on testing? You would have to say that the results of the testing are valueless, so that $500 was meaningless. The only argument that you have about valuelessness is on that first point, which deals with, like I said, the SAT exam and maybe college admissions. As a perfect illustration of one of the problems that you've got here in this argument, you compare the United States to a whole bunch of other countries, and guess what's being used to make those comparisons? Standardized test results. So in essence, we need the standardized test to be able to know how we are doing in comparison to the rest of the world in terms of their performance, that sort of thing. So why is it useless, in other contexts? I'm not quite sure what the issue here is. The argument that there might be a hypothetical problem because somebody is having a bad day or that there's potential exam stress, I'm not saying that those things don't exist. They certainly do. How significant they are on any kind of test, whether it is, we have our final next week or our midterm 48 hours from now, or you're taking the SAT exam, the impact that it has either on the student is not measurable, and the impact that it has on the test scores is not measurable, at least not from any of the information that you presented here. I thought you did a pretty good job citing your sources in the presentation, but the presentation itself is a little problematic. You never look at the audience. There's too much reading. You sound either a little bit nervous or a little bit tired at the beginning of the speech. At the end, there's a summary, but you do end up with that muttered under your breath Porky Pig exit, so I'd like to avoid that in the future. Thank you.